Thanks for having me, and it's been fun to visit. So, okay. Yeah, so understanding complex noisy data streams are obviously a really important part of vision, and part of cognition in general, right? So, parsing the sort of buzzing, blooming, buzzing confusion of the world is like a really challenging piece of figuring out how to then deal with the world, right? Before I go forward, I should say, I definitely would like questions in the middle of the presentation, right? So, stop me anytime. I would much prefer to not get through my slides, but like actually communicate than, sort of just talk at you guys for an hour. So, there's slides and I have some like prepared text or something, but please just interrupt me when relevant. As I was saying, this type of sort of noisy data streams, parsing them is really important. You look at that image, you can tell pretty quickly there's two cars, one is in front of the other, they're on a field in front of some mountains, and it's much faster for you to figure that out than for me to say it. And you can do this despite a huge amount of variation, right? Like position, pose, size, illumination, distortion and noise. I mean, background variation, scene variation, right? Presumably you haven't seen this image before, but you can still tell there's a car. And even if you don't know what an alpha is, you can still tell it's a car. There's obviously a lot of variation that makes this problem challenging. This is true also in other domains, not just in vision, right? So you look at that, it's hard for you to tell what that says unless you were here before I was testing. Yeah, that says Hannah is good at compromising. And you could tell that even though you probably haven't heard that particular sentence before with that speaker identity and so forth. And what's really going on is that there's some sense in which a sort of explicit representation is being constructed where somehow under some objective function, the categories of interest are being pulled apart. And you really need to do two things to make that happen. You need to have selectivity for different objects, right? You need to tell when it's, one car versus, a boat or something. And you need to have tolerance for changes to the input, right? So computationally easy to have any one of these things, right? You could have templates or integration to get either of them, but together is really hard, right? So, a way to visualize this, right, is that you have population representation of a thing along some kind of manifold, right? Say an object identity manifold as this face is sort of transforming through space. And a good representation will have this property, that two different faces will be separated across all those different transformations. A bad one would look like this, right? But the real one on the pixels is like this, right? In some sense, this is the problem, is that they're all kind of jumbled up together, right? There's this tremendous tangling of the interests, of the factors of interest, right? Another way to think about this is that the sort of natural physics axes of the world, like for example, retinal photoreceptor voltages or hair cell point amplitudes, those are the sensors for the different devices, right? Things that are straight in those axes are really not straight in the axes of natural behavioral events, like a deforming face moving through complex lit environment. They're totally misaligned, okay? So that's one reason why the problems of this kind are computationally hard. There's a sort of nonlinear misalignment. But also it really needs to be done fast, which is another reason why the computation is hard, right? When you look at those images and you can figure out what's going on in them, you kind of know what the stuff is, way faster than it is for you to say what they are. And you can do it while you're listening to me talk. Nonetheless, that processing has to happen somehow pretty quickly in parallel, right? And in fact, if you think of the object core representation regime as being sort of roughly 100 to 200 milliseconds of looking at an image, I mean, humans are significantly higher than chance. They're practically at, maxing out their power even by that very short duration, right? So the core idea is that cortical brain meat, effectively, is doing some kind of computation to go from this representation to this representation. Okay, and in particular that it's somehow untangling those very tangled up structures, right? And it's well known from a lot of neurophysiology and anatomy and stuff that those processes are likely as sensory cascades. There's a series of fairly simple operations, but that nonetheless, that when sort of put in series, they do this very complicated, nonlinear unentangling. Okay, now. sort of putting a bunch of neuroanatomical, cytoarchitectonic, and sort of latency evidence together, what you see in the visual system, this is the ventral visual stream, and in particular, this is this idea that a lot of object recognition and other higher level visual behaviors may be readoutable here, roughly at the top of this sequence of processing, where maybe each stage is roughly 10 milliseconds after you get into cortex. So you have this sequence of brain areas that pass data on. This is what a sensory cascade looks like, sort of roughly. Another way to think about it is that information comes in on the retina, and then it sort of gets represented or re-represented out through these different layers to the point that by the time it gets to the top of the ventral visual stream in the inferior temporal cortex, it's possible to read out lots of interesting things easily from that neural representation. Okay? So, if you want to think about this in terms of the sort of the fast-moving the version of it is something like this, where you basically have, that sort of sequence of things going on in your head like that. Right? You're looking at the images, and the neurons are firing in this sort of sequential way, roughly doing something different for each image, but somehow in such a way that by the time it gets to this area at the top, lots of things have become explicit about what's going on in the scene. Question?
So is it like an implicit property of information-bearing objects that they exist on some smooth manifold?
It's probably not smooth in the sense that, there may be clear ways in which small changes in the pixel representation lead to big changes downstream. And so, you can think of non-tangling as being, or entangling as being a process that actually it makes things look that are quite fairly non-smooth, actually. And you have to kind of have to smooth them out a bit.
So you're adding something to the data in the smoothing process?
You're adding well, in a sense, yeah. I mean, if you've learned the parameters of that process, you're adding your prior information about what the parameters should do, right? So, of course, the information is all in the image, if you can see it by looking what the thing is, right? So in a sense, it's like it's not like the information has increased, the amount of information in a Shannon theoretic sense increases. That's not possible, right? But that doesn't preclude it being the case that the information is laid out in a smoother way so that simple decoders can get at it. And I think that's a good way to think about it, is not that to the extent you're adding information, you're adding the same information for every image, and that information is your priors about, given a given pattern, how should something be smoothed out effectively. Okay, does that make sense? Yeah, okay. So, underlying this is this idea there's these kind of three things: stimulus, neurons, and behavior. So stimuli are what comes in, neurons are this stuff in the middle, and behavior is what you read out of this, right? And so what I just said basically in response to your question was the idea that there's this kind of information transformation process that actually loses a bunch of information. That's why I've drawn it as like a bottleneck or like an hourglass kind of structure. And then it sort of pushes it into this representation that can then be read out to do many different things, like figure out what the category is, location, size, pose, et cetera. Okay? In a way where it would be really hard to do this with linear readouts if you were in this representation, right? Basically, that kind of untangling occurs. Now, to just make that concrete, I'm going to tell you a little bit about a multi-array electrophysiology experiment in macaque. Okay, so this was done in collaboration with Ha Hong and Jim DiCarlo and Jim's group at MIT. And what was done was implant of a multi-array electrode arrays into V4 and IT. These are sort of toward the top of the ventral visual stream, a couple of hundred sites collected. And with that setup, about 6,000 images were recorded, responses to 6,000 images. So in this case, the images were constructed by taking 64 three-dimensional objects, putting them in categories, actually there's 8 categories of objects, and putting them on uncorrelated photographic backgrounds, okay, at 3 levels of variation. So like low variation where the objects are at a fixed position, pose, and size, a medium level variation, and then a high level variation where the object can sort of be all over the place at different poses, sizes. And the object categories are sort of these natural, sort of random selection of natural categories: animals, boats, cars, chairs, etc. So that gives you just a sense of what is in that. So if you take that image set and record it with the setup I mentioned a moment ago, and then you bin the spike count of each neuron, the neurons spike, They don't start spiking until a bit after the actual images are presented, right? Because you have to wait for the data to get through the visual system. And so if you bin it 70 to 170 milliseconds post-stimulus presentation and you average it over a bunch of repetitions, then you get one scalar per neuron per image. And that's what's in this matrix, effectively, okay? So first I want to talk about why this data is interesting. What about this data makes it useful? So I'll come back to that. Imagine you have that data and you try to do some decoding from it, meaning that you want to build a linear combination across neurons to do something like detect if it's an animal or not, or a different linear combination if it's a car or not, whatever. So those are linearly trying to read out from the neural representation, the neural responses, what's present in the image, okay? If you do that with the V4 data, that's data from the V4 area, which is kind of an intermediate visual area, what you see is that it's quite good at low variation, right? So if you try to detect animals versus boats versus cars, et cetera, the sort of 8-way categorization task, it's at like something like 60-something or almost 70% at low variation. Chance here is 12.5% since it's an 8-way task. But at high variation, V4 is much worse. Even though the neurons are being driven by the images, the stuff is in the receptive fields of the neurons, for those who think about such things. So, but nonetheless, the population is not able to easily decode what's going on, what the content of the image is, okay? You can actually look at human data on a whole bunch of these tasks, such as the basic animals versus boats versus cars task, or like a within category, in an in-category cars task, or with an in-category faces task, like faces versus each other, you can measure human behavior. And what you see is that actually on this basic categorization task, that's the black bar now, humans are way better at high variation than V4 is. Okay, they're more comparable at low variation, they're way better at high variation. But if you look at the IT population, that's the area after V4 in the ventral stream sequence, IT is much better, okay? So you can decode pretty well out of IT features treated as like machine learning features, right? With a linear decoder, you can decode what the object is pretty well, okay? Now this was back in 2012, and when we first looked at this, a lot of machine learning algorithms at the time were also getting like smushed by that high variation learning, the high variation part of the data set, right? So there's something about the computations being done in IT from V4 to IT that were interesting, right? And actually, if you look at many different tasks, each dot here is actually a different visual task. What you see is that comparing the neural decode to human performance, you can predict it pretty well out of IT. So the same things humans are bad at, IT is bad at, same thing humans are good at, IT is good at. You can predict it pretty well out of this top-level visual representation, but less well out of V4, and actually much less well out of earlier layers in the sequence, right? So what this is saying is not just the performance is good, but that these neural features are making an interesting pattern, okay? And that pattern is predicting the human pattern. Right? So in some detailed way, behavior is following these neurons, right? So what that's basically to say is that those neurons are worth explaining, okay? I think I will, hold on, mute that one. So what you can just see, just briefly here, is that monkeys actually can do this behavior as well, and you can record, exactly what behavioral patterns they make. And if you see that, then in fact, you record their errors, that monkeys on this task are very similar to what human behavioral patterns, errors humans will make. So that suggests that there's something similar. There's the neurons in the monkeys are predicting the human behavior and also predicting monkey behavior. So what this basically says is that somehow that visual representation, by the time you get up to IT, is doing this decoding in this untangling in such a way that linear readout is able to predict, say, category behavior, right? So all this is sort of a long way of saying that a predictive model of neural responses in this pathway is of interest, okay? You want to do this because you want to come up with a quantitative hypothesis for what generated those neurons, those neural responses, right? That's why it's interesting for that reason, okay? So the obvious solution is to use something like convolutional neural networks, right? And this was even obvious 5 years ago because they sort of build in the basic neuroanatomy of the ventral stream, that they're like hierarchical and they're retinotopic, that is to say spatially tiled, right? So these were the things that were known from the neuroanatomy, and therefore it sort of made obvious sense to use a system that had these, and convolutional neural networks were designed with these in mind, right? So just briefly, I'm sure many people here are familiar with them. These are these multi-layer neural networks, and individual layers of the neural networks have made up of these sort of neurally plausible basic operations like filtering, thresholding, pooling, normalization, et cetera. Each of which has a kind of like neuroscience interpretation and a data science interpretation. So you can think of these as being useful for various reasons. I'm not going to go into the details of all of this. This sort of boils down a tremendous amount of work that people did over decades, and I'm going to just posit that we use this. The key thing is that these structures are applied convolutionally, meaning basically the same at all locations. I mean, in theory, you don't have to have weight sharing, but that's the typical idea to make it both tractable and also deal with the fact that sort of natural statistics are pretty similar at different locations. So that meaning that if you have an input which is image-like, you get an output which is image-like too. And then in this particular picture, there's like one gray slice per filter type. Okay. In natural images, averaged over many trials, models like this with the types of nonlinearities that I mentioned a moment ago and that type of filters of this kind predict roughly 50% of variance in natural stimuli in V1 neurons. That is to say, early in the ventral stream. Okay, and a key insight is that one of the reasons that they are able to do this is that the filters have this sort of nice shape, roughly in the form of Gabor wavelets, where there's different wavelet elements for different orientations and frequencies. So this sort of boils up down together like a tremendous decades of work in visual systems neuroscience to come up with this idea that a sort of one-layer convolutional network does a reasonable job presenting neurons' responses in early visual cortex. You know, it's useful to think about where this comes from, right? I mean, of course, you can think of it as being sort of the intuition of the discoverers of V1 and their properties of V1. Like, there's just this fixed basis set that just makes sense if you're smart enough, and maybe you can figure out what good properties of a basis set should have and do that in general. Anyway, it seems natural in this case, if looking at their experiments, to kind of theorize something like these basis elements. There are other good ways to do this as well. The idea that basically you want to have neurons represent their environment and do so as efficiently as possible. And that's this kind of sparse coding idea that Osals and Field and others came up with, which is basically the idea that if you want to, if you have a network that takes an image in and it has to produce the same image out from through a hidden layer, and you impose that there is a sparsity prior on the hidden layer, then it turns out that if you train the elements of the first layer filters to do this, you'll get filters that look roughly like Gabor's. Okay? So that's a really nice idea because it gives you a kind of underlying reason to understand why the filters are the way they are in a kind of in a principled way. So it's natural to take some of those ideas and sort of push them up the ventral stream, right? If you're interested in neural responses in higher cortical areas. So after all, you know, like input is image-like, output's image-like. You can just keep stacking, right? Of course, there's a huge number of parameters consistent with that idea, right? There's like architectural parameters, how many layers, how many filters, et cetera, network structure. There's filter parameters themselves, like continuous values and all the filter templates. So that's a huge number of parameters, and this obvious big question is how do you find the right parameters, okay? I'm going to just say, and that, like, understanding why this is the case is a lot of discussion, but basically it turns out to be really hard to generalize these basic approaches to many layer networks, okay? There's no obvious way to do this in a way that works, okay? There's another strategy, which is neural fitting, right? You basically record data, and then you fit the parameters that do this, that produce the neural responses, right, on per image basis. But it turns out that it's really hard to do that too, because there's not enough neural data to constrain this very large model class. Right? It's a very nice idea, but in practice, it sort of leads to overfitting. And so the basic state of affairs a number of years ago when we started looking at this was that direct neural fitting was less successful in higher visual areas, V4 IT, et cetera. So we came up with a strategy which is sort of obvious. There's nothing big, there's nothing non-trivial about this idea, is that you use the other constraint you have, which is you know that the system has to do a task. Right? I mean, I showed you that earlier. The system actually does do a really interesting behavioral task, like optimize for categorization, and then just fix the parameters that way, and then compare to neural data, right? So there's really two underlying metrics here. There's a performance metric, accuracy on some challenging high variation visual object categorization task, and neural predictivity, the ability of the model to predict each individual site's neural activity, right? And so the idea is that if you do this for a challenging task, and it's to say challenging for network engineer, but the animal should do the task, the hypothesis was, if you do this, then you'll get a better, optimize on one, you'll get better in two. Of course, this begs the question of what it means to map a neural system to the brain. One way of thinking about this is, imagine you have two brains, a source brain and a target brain. A very natural way to do this is to just ask that one be the linear transform of another, right? It's probably not the case that for every neuron in monkey 1, there's exact neuron in monkey 2 that exactly matches it. But it sort of makes sense to give yourself a little slip room that neurons in monkey 1 are a linear combination of neurons in monkey 2, and that's the slip room we give ourselves in comparing a model to the brain. In other words, basically treat each neural site as a linear combination of model units, figure that out, the mapping with linear regression, and then accuracy is goodness of fit on held out testing images, okay? So the question was whether or not we could do that. So before we got into trying to deeply optimize neural networks to solve the task, we wanted to do some simple high throughput experiments to check whether we had a chance. So first of all, we did something like random selection of model parameters, random selection of those architectural parameters I mentioned a moment ago, and then measured both performance and neural predictivity. And each dot here is a different model. And what you see is that there's a modest, reasonable correlation between performance on the one hand and neural predictivity on the other. So it's about 0.55. There's quite a bit of variability as well. So this wasn't terrible. But it led us to think, well, what if we did some hyperparameter optimization on the architectural parameters and then just measured neural predictivity? That's what the blue dots are. So each blue dot here is, again, a different model. You see that the optimization works pretty well, that you're able to get out to the right, but also that the correlation increases a lot, that this is now roughly at 0.8 now. So this suggests, well, if you want to get better at making good predictivity, maybe you should performance optimize, right? Of course, the opposite, the other thing might make sense as well, optimize for neural predictivity and then measure performance, and that's what these red dots are. And this was interesting because it sort of re-emphasized our overfitting problem, which was that although you could optimize for neural predictivity, you didn't actually get a lot better than you would do by just optimizing for performance alone, and you didn't get your predictivity back. I mean, the performance back. So blue made a lot more sense than red. But really, this was fine. This was where we were at the time relative to a bunch of other approaches. But the problem was we were sort of bad everywhere, right? We really wanted to be up to the right. Okay, that was basically the problem. And so we had to do much better at optimizing for performance. And we did a bunch of stuff. We basically threw the kitchen sink at it, not with the idea that the optimization method itself would be anything biological, but just to see if we could push out to the right. And so we did a bunch of things to sort of improve architectural parameters. So I mentioned that automated metaparameter optimization, ensembles of models chosen through boosting, and also filter parameter optimization using stochastic gradient descent on whatever categorization task we had available. And at the time, we didn't quite use a softmax. We used slightly different loss functions that are typical now, but very similar idea. And with those ideas together, produced a model. And we did it with a bunch of different training sets. It turns out that the most effective one is this ImageNet training set, which has by now become a standard in the field, which is thousands of images and thousands of categories. Okay. And the idea was training on real photos. The first question was, well, okay, having done that, does it generalize to the types of stimuli that we had here, right? And to make the sort of test as strong as we could, we removed categories of photographs that didn't appear in the test stimuli. Okay, so no animals, no boats, no cars, et cetera. Okay, we got a model that way, and then we tested it, and it turned out that actually, as you get better on this training task, you get better at the performance on the testing task as well. So generalization worked pretty well. Okay, in other words, there were features we're learning something that was useful for general sort of object recognition, even though we hadn't seen those particular categories before. I should say, at each point, what's happening is we're retraining an 8-way classifier on the top hidden layer of this thing. Okay, just to put it in perspective, remember there's this picture I showed you before. The red bar was the model that came out of that. Okay, so it was doing pretty well on that high variation condition that was stymieing V4 and some other models. Okay, so our core question was, does it predict neurons better thereby? Okay, this is one representation of the data that's useful to look at for some neurons. So here what we're seeing is basically, this is neuron 53 in IT, and it's like, its responses is not time, okay? This is just responses laid out on a per category basis. And so each dot is like, there's thousands of testing images here, okay? And so, you know, what you see is that this is a face neuron because it really likes to respond to faces way above the baseline level. Okay, so this is just an easy neuron to look at in this type of representation. And so what you can see is that if you try to predict using that linear regression metric, this neuron from the top hidden layer of the model I mentioned a moment ago, it does a pretty good job. Okay, not perfect. This is an R-squared of about 0.55. Okay, but it's fitting a lot of the, it's sort of matching a lot of the ups and downs of the neuron. And this is true, you know, not just for neurons like that are really easy to interpret, like the face neurons, but also for others like, you know, site 42, which is, I don't know exactly what it is, but it has a bunch of peaks, and the neurons are able to be fit pretty well. You know, the red line being the prediction. And so we were able to go quite a bit up to the right, is the basic short story there. That if the blue dots were what you see in the, now here in the lower left, we were able to go up here, so, you know, more than 100% improvement in neural fitting, and much better at performance as well. So that was really gratifying, and it suggested we could have kind of predictive models of, or at least reasonably predictive models of higher cortical areas, which was really hard to figure out, and there's kind of these mysterious areas we don't know exactly what they're responding to. But that led us to, given that, we wanted to then sort of investigate what was going on with them, right? So one way to do that is to compare the different layers of the model to the data. Okay, so what we're trying to do here is fit that same neuron I showed you before, but with layer 1, okay, the first layer. And what you see is it's basically able to capture like the low variation part. So in this way, I've laid it out by category, but then within each block by variability. So the images where there's like head-on, fixed position, pose, and size, those are all in the sort of left part of each block, right? So that layer 1 is able to be selective, but when you look at the sort of higher variation conditions, it's just not able to be robust, tolerant as well. But if you go up through the layers, that's what's able to be done. You'll be able to be both selective and tolerant at the same time. So this is a pretty natural way of thinking about how tolerance is built through the layers of the network. And what you see if you look at a median over all the units in IT cortex, that layer is significant, you know, sort of as you go up through the layers, you get better. That's what those red bars are. Now, if it were the case that the neurons were totally driven by their categorical value, this wouldn't be that interesting, right? Because of course, if you're good at getting categorization and your neurons are totally driven by categories alone, like they're just categorical in their responses, well, that's sort of obvious that should work. So to just check that out, we did something like built ideal observer models. So basically, models that try to predict neurons by knowing the category perfectly, or all of the variables that generated the image, the position, the pose, the size, et cetera. That's what you see here. So they're significantly less good. They're certainly better than chance here in IT, but they're much less good, okay? Oh, question?
So is the opposite the case, that you could, so you're looking at the V5 neuron?
Well, IT, it's like V5, yeah.
Okay, yeah, so if you're looking down the layers of your model, you get a representation of the previous layers in the brain.
We'll get there.
Okay.
It's a good question. Yeah.
Was the data collected while the animals were doing categorization?
No. So these are data collected. So it's interesting. All the neural data I have shown you so far is where the animal is doing RSVP. It's just sitting there staring at the image. And you know, the animal's task is to make sure that its fixation doesn't leave the center of the image. Okay. Now it's a good question. What happens differently in the neurons if the animal is doing a task? It's a great question that I'm going to mostly not talk about today. But just notice one thing is, you remember I showed you those relationships between neural data and human performance? Just, it's funny, what's going on there is that it's monkeys doing nothing, predicting humans doing the task. So even if you are, basically that suggests, okay, don't worry about that issue too much for the purposes of what I'm going to tell you today. If you're worried about dynamics and all that, that might change. But if you're interested in just that sort of like 70 to 170 millisecond temporal average bin, then maybe you're okay, because that average bin in the monkey doing nothing, well, it's not awake, it's not asleep, okay? It's an awake behaving monkey where the behavior is to fixate. What that says is that, you know, basically as long as if the animal were anesthetized, like I said earlier, I mean, nothing would happen. You wouldn't see responses in IT. But as long as the animal's awake and it's motivated to do at least something, it's watching the image, then, you know, you can predict from those neural responses, you can decode behavior. and quite accurately at a sort of per task level. So it's worth explaining data. The data is worth explaining, even if there's more details that if the animal were doing something. Okay. But what I was saying here was basically that the fact that these categorical or sort of all variables ideal observers didn't predict the data nearly as well as those models suggests that you kind of need both a performance constraint. It's got to actually do the task. The ideal observers, quote, do the task, although they're not models, and the neural networks do the task. But you also need to actually be a real neural network. And it's basically those two things together, kind of performance constraint, but with an architectural constraint that leads to the better neural predictivity. You can't just read the category off the image and that's what the neuron is doing. Okay? But now to your question earlier about thinking about intermediate data, we actually also had data in other visual areas like V4. Okay? So we wanted to compare to that. And just to give you a sense of what V4 data looks like, if you put it in that same representation that I showed you the face neuron in before, it looks like this, which is basically a mess. Okay, and this is way subsampled because otherwise it would just be a black blob. This is why V4 is hard to understand. Okay. Now it turns out that if you look at early layers in the model and late layers in the model, you don't do a particularly good job of explaining this data. Okay, neural regression is not that great. Okay, but if you look at intermediate layers, especially this layer 3, you do a not bad job. Okay, certainly better than you do in the early or late layers. Okay, so I can't tell you why this neuron is doing that stuff, why those peaks are the way they are. But what this is saying is this intermediate layer of the network optimized to do this downstream task has the right nonlinear basis to predict that neuron. Okay, so if you summarize this across all the V4 neurons in the population, what you see is that that's like saying basically that you sort of peak in the middle in terms of your predictivity. Okay, and again, you're way better than other existing models were. And just to sort of drive the point home, these categorical ideal observables are terrible at V4. They're basically not above chance. Question?
This kind of relates to our previous discussion in version, but if those intermediate layers are best in prediction, right? I mean, they may correspond to earlier parts of IT, because IT is several stages. It's not only one stage, right?
So you're saying
That layer 3 neuron, I mean, you cannot really.
oh, totally, yeah. There's nothing special about this being 4, right? So I don't mean to give that impression. Deeper models that we can build now are better, and they parse out the intermediate layers better. So this is, it's like, it scales and improves as you, like 100 layers get worse. You know, of course, you can do better on the task, eventually better than humans, but it doesn't track with the neurons after a certain point. So that doesn't work super well. But if you have, 10 layers or 8 layers, probably closer to the number of receptive fields, this is later work, you can get a better picture and you can maybe parcel out those areas. Unfortunately, we don't have quite enough data in PIT, CIT, AIT right now separately to be statistically sure about that. But in practice, I totally agree. There's nothing like this layer 3 is like just V4 and that's it alone. But I don't mean to suggest that. I mean to say something like the intermediate style computations that you have to do, you have to have them, and when you have them, they give you a better picture of what the intermediate neural response areas are like. Okay, that just contrasts that IT goes up through the layers, this V4 predictivity peaked in the middle. And as we and many others observed, early layers also get what look like Gabor wavelets and a variety of other interesting phenomenology in layer 1, in early layers. And others, probably better than us, have shown that those are like certainly among the layers of the model, the best prediction of early visual cortexes in the early model layers. That's not to say that these models of V1 are better than other models of V1, maybe that are more detailed biologically, and those comparisons are really interesting to do and I think open at this point. But anyway, what you can see from this is basically, I think I'll skip that in for time, but what this basically is suggesting is that if you complement a sort of from below approach where you try to figure out what each layer is doing and then think about it, and then build new filters on top of those, with this kind of top-down approach where you impose a behavioral constraint, with the architecture, what you actually get is a pretty good picture of like constraints at multiple different layers along the pathway. We don't have any V2 data ourselves, so we really can't make that comparison very carefully. But to some extent, it's been made. Okay, so this was a really useful kind of intermediate modeling point because it suggested that although we didn't exactly know what all those intermediate or early layers were doing, we could put like this architectural piece of knowledge down and the functional piece of knowledge down, and although they were kind of broad strokes by themselves, neither one alone sort of tells you exactly what the model needs to be. Putting them together gives you a pretty more quantitatively exact picture. So that was good. But at the same time, it's like you'd really like to be able to know something qualitative as well from such a model, right? So this is like a black box. I mean, it's not a black box model in the sense that from a pure, this gets on me, my nerves a little bit. People say it's a black box model of a black box system, so what do you learn, right? And of course, it's a totally transparent box in the sense that the cost of measuring everything about it is practically zero, or it's whatever like it costs to run your GPU, right? So, I mean, the brain is a black box because it's extraordinarily expensive to figure out what its synapses, well, you can't do that, but to measure the activity is very expensive, et cetera, right? So it's in some sense, this box is extremely transparent, but what it isn't is obviously understandable, okay? It's not simple. So what you really want to do with such a thing is, well, how do you generate sort of qualitative predictions that are useful or interesting? And the basic approach, and this is the only one that I really believe in at this point, is you do a bunch of experiments, and when something comes out of it that does not match your intuition, then you check it out in the real data. Okay, so that's a strategic plan for coming up with qualitative predictions. And so I'll tell you now about one of the more interesting ones that we saw. Okay, so obviously you can do categorization tasks, right? You look at that image and you see it's a plane, and maybe you know it's an F-16. But you can also like not only tell what it is, but you can tell where it is and how big it is, and its aspect ratio and stuff like that, right? In fact, you can sort of quickly assess the scene as a whole, right? So the obvious question is, where are all these properties coded neurally, right? A sort of obvious hypothesis, and this was like kind of our word model too, even if you look at, especially given what I showed you a minute ago, right? That basically it would not be at the top of the ventral stream where these properties are encoded, right? Because basically you imagine the kind of transformations of over identity preserving, like transformations are aggregated at each layer. That's kind of how you imagine invariance is built. At least it's natural to imagine invariance being built that way, right? So like as receptive field size increases, you might imagine category tolerance increases, but like position sensitivity goes down, right? That's a very natural thing to think. Certainly we thought roughly a version of that. So maybe these properties might be encoded, like position certainly, earlier in visual areas or somewhere else in the brain. So just to sort of put like various hypotheses down, previous studies had told us that for categorical properties, information went up through the layers. Okay? For the category orthogonal properties, what did we know? Well, one hypothesis would be that there would be a tolerance sensitivity trade-off. That's very natural. Okay? H2 is like a tolerance sensitivity trade-off, but where like V1 is better than human, so maybe you're at human performance when you get to IT. Okay? Then there's this other performance. This is what Jim, my postdoc advisors, thought was probably going to happen, was that actually for the category orthogonal properties, information would be, quote, preserved. Okay, that you wouldn't totally lose. It wouldn't make sense to throw it out if you could use it, so why would you? So information would somehow be preserved. So we wanted to figure out which one of these it would be. And in doing so, we sort of ran into various tasks and found something that we weren't totally expecting, which was that as you got better at the categorization task, performance out of the top hidden layer was getting better on a position estimation task. Okay, even though the goal was to become invariant to position, and it was getting much better at that. Okay, so this was a little surprising, maybe not impossible, but certainly a little surprising. So then we thought, well, maybe this was H2, not H1, maybe it was H2. This was true for all the tasks that we looked at. So position estimation, scale, rotation, et cetera. But we thought it was maybe H2, so we figured out, okay, which layer is position estimation going to peak in? Is it early, in the middle? I kind of thought it would be in the middle because you'd have boundary detection, and that would give you, I don't know, where the objects are, roughly. But as it turns out, you get better as you go through the layers as well. Okay, increased performance on the position estimation task at each model layer. And this was true for all the tasks that we could check the model out on. Right, and this was like one of 12 experiments I ran that week, right? And it was the only one that did something that I was not expecting. So eventually we convinced ourselves that we should collect more data to figure out whether or not the data was in line with this, okay? Because it was a little out of line with what we would expect. And we reproduced, our original result that categorization was better in IT than V4. This is a given setup. That's good. Better than V1. V4 better than V1. But actually, it turns out that IT is also better than V4 at position estimation. And in fact, if you look across all the various tasks, we found that in general, well, always IT was better than V4, and usually V4 was better than V1 across all these tasks, okay? We also did an experiment like this, which was sort of more like classic standard receptive field mapping stimuli, which have sort of like an X and Y position and an orientation property, because we expected to find like a different result here, given what people have known, and indeed it is true, right? The classical results are, we didn't like contradict them or anything, okay? In other words, for things like X and Y position, V1 is better than these higher areas, okay, for these types of stimuli. Go ahead.
Can you just clarify, this is V1 data, or this is
Both. Well, this particular plot is V1 model, but V1 data also, even more so, has this property. And we later checked that out.
Okay.
Yeah, so, V1 is really good at barcode reading, effectively, right? It's not surprising. It can tell where these, it's good at figuring this stuff out, right? Better than humans, in fact. Probably better than, so far as we can tell, better than humans. So it's not like we weren't contradicting the known knowledge. And to sort of put this in the perspective of human behavior, if you measure behavior for all these different tasks and you plot performance fraction, neural performance fraction relative to human behavior as a function of number of units that you draw from, this is on a semi-log plot, then what you see is that, you increase for each unit a certain amount of performance on categorization tasks like basic categorization like animals versus boats, et cetera, or subordinate identification, cars versus each other, roughly at the same rate. But this is also true across many different tasks, across all the tasks effectively. And it's much more constant in IT than it is for the other areas. So basically it's like saying, for every single added bit of power that you get on an additional unit in IT, on one of these tasks you kind of get equal amounts of power on all these other tasks. Not exactly, but reasonably so. So really what's going on is this, okay, at least for these types of tasks. Okay, and this is really the crucial thing. It's really not about the task, as it turns out. It's more about the nature of the stimuli. Okay, so what you should take away from this is one, IT is definitely not invariant. Okay, and so if you think of a sort of specific general idea of Hubel and Wiesel as aggregating over invariant dimensions, that's definitely not what's happening in this ventral stream process. But perhaps some kind of generic aggregation is. Okay, but you're not aggregating over the invariant dimensions. Of the category, identity preserving transformations. Lower level properties are not that low level. Okay, we thought of there as being low level properties like position, at least with complex objects on complex backgrounds. And it's not like they're intermediate either, which is kind of what I was betting based on border detection. In particular, really, it depends on the nature of the stimuli. For very simple stimuli, there will be properties that are low level. Okay, but for these complex stimuli, all the properties travel together, the categorical and non-categorical properties together. And it's not just that not all position information is lost, but actually it's not that the information is produced like we talked about earlier, but it's made more explicit for every one of these types of categories. So maybe this suggests that IT is doing some kind of generic scene parsing, sort of the parafoveal or central image area. But just to sort of summarize why this was useful is that, of course, you could have discovered this if you had the data, right? You didn't need the neural network model to do this, right? This is all data. But we would never have done the experiment allowing us to make these plots if we hadn't suspected that this could possibly be true. And the only reason we did this is because we ran a bunch of experiments with a model that had some potential to be right, but that we didn't expect that answer. Okay, so that's the sense in which I think predictive models are useful, even if they're not totally understandable in all their details. Okay, so around the time that I was doing this, I really thought it might be interesting to look into some things in auditory cortex as well, because it also seemed to have a bunch of properties that were like the kinds of invariance things that were happening in vision. And of course, not exactly the same, but sort of roughly related. And so I ran into these folks also at MIT. Alex, Sam, and Josh, who were really interested in audition. And so together we went down the road of trying to think about how some of these ideas apply in auditory cortex. So just as a little background, auditory cortex has a lot of, is actually presupposing and uses a tremendous amount of really interesting auditory subcortical processing. So, you know, these inferior colliculus, various areas of auditory subcortex that are doing a lot of really interesting things after the cochlea. But there's this area of cortex, green thing, which is about, you know, it's a bit anterior of early visual cortex, sort of roughly there. And the question was, what are those units doing, right? So what was known was that there's roughly a kind of core belt parabelt structure. Not perfectly well. This is a monkey brain. We actually measured in humans, and so this is just schematic. But in the primary area of auditory cortex, it was thought that basically some kind of spatiotemporal filtering was occurring, but that in these sort of other non-primary auditory areas like the belt or the parabelt, it was sort of not totally clear exactly what was happening. Okay, so this was our question: is, could we figure out like better models of non-primary, that is to say, higher auditory cortex? So I did a bunch of different ways of dealing with this. Actually, 1D convolutions were the most obvious thing since time is sort of evidently local. But it also turned out to be useful, in fact, more efficient to treat frequency as local as well. And that is to say, use a coarse model of the cochlea as the input. Okay, so that is to say, to transform sort of amplitude into this type of diagram. Okay, this sort of like cochleogram representation. And to stick those into a convnet, okay, was the strategy. So basically, optimize for performance on a challenging auditory task, and then compare to neural data. So let's get the mic off. And so the task that we decided to use was a 600-way word recognition task. So taking a bunch of words from various speech databases, Timmit, Wall Street Journal, et cetera, these are various speech corpora, and combining it with significant background noise. So that's what the samples would sound like. She had your dark suit and greasy wash water all year with, like, you know, auditory scenes and speech babble and music clips in the background. So it was really non-trivial. And the task was pick out the middle word in each 1 second clip. So like if she had you would be picking out had, okay? And so humans are definitely above chance. Chance is way below 1% here. And humans are around, I don't know, 70-something% on this task. They're doing pretty well, but far from ceiling. By optimizing network, we can do pretty well. This is showing performance up through the layers of such a network. So close, not quite at, but close to human performance at the top layer of this network, measured on held out data with different speakers and different auditory backgrounds, et cetera. So the question was how to compare this to neural data. But before we did that, we wanted to understand, like, was the behavioral comparison useful? Okay, and there's a lot of interesting behavioral work you can do with auditory data, kind of look at the patterns. So in particular, you can take something like various like clips and put them on either dry or like noise backgrounds of various kinds, like auditory scenes, speech babble, music, speech shape noise at different levels, different signal to noise ratio levels. Okay. Again, doing a 600-way task. And what happens is that if you actually measure human performance on this for each of the different performance conditions, you get a pattern, you know, with different like levels of noise and different proportion, you get different proportions correct for different types of noise backgrounds, okay? And so it turns out that actually if you look at the model that we built versus this human pattern, it predicts it pretty well, okay? So not perfectly, but, you know, really hard to distinguish from different humans. Different humans don't predict each other perfectly here either. So the model prediction is pretty good at this sort of behavioral pattern. You know, noting, of course, that this network was not optimized to get this pattern correct. It just happens to fall out behaviorally. This is a little bit like the pattern, the scatter plot of dots that I showed you before for the visual system. You can also look at ask whether the distance space of the model is a good way of predicting the actual distortion of the signal by measuring the abs diff of dry versus wet. And just to make a long story short there, early layers don't predict human portion, the sort of distortion in the layers responses don't predict that well. But as you go up through the layers, you get much, much better behaviorally. So task optimized CNN does discover a kind of reasonable space in which to think about the distances between stimuli as predicting performance, you know, proportions correct behaviorally. So okay, so we were in a situation where we had something that was performing reasonably well, was doing the behavioral pattern reasonably well. So we wanted to ask to what extent it predicted neural responses. Now in this case, we were using humans for a couple of reasons. One is my collaborators work with humans, so I had no choice. The other was that humans do this stuff, whereas it's hard to get macaques to do a lot of these, to like do, it's not clear that they really have good responses to a lot of these things. And so Sam and Nancy and Josh McDermott, Nancy Camisher and Josh McDermott measured 165 commonly heard natural sounds. And while humans were listening to them, brains were being measured with MRI, fMRI. So like baby crying or running water or, like car horn or text, speech. So just a variety of stuff, right? And then of course for each voxel, measure an average response to each sound, right? Nothing like the temporal resolution or spatial resolution that we have with the electrophys data, okay? But it produces a data matrix of roughly the same form for our purposes, okay? So it's like sounds versus voxels. And of course, this is a sort of ugly situation where the number of predictors, if you're doing decoding, this is an ugly situation where the number of voxels is way bigger than the number of stimuli. So you have to do all sorts of stuff to prevent overfitting. Actually, for us, it's not a big deal because we separately predict each voxel. So for us, it's just like more checks, okay? So we were interested in using a similar regression metric to do this. And I should say, although it's the case that we use the same types of regressions here, if you look at how many units were needed, I should have had a slide of this, how many units were needed to predict each voxel, you need many more units averaged here to predict voxels than you do in the electrophys case, okay? So there's some titration to the resolution of the mapping that should be explored more, but we really haven't done yet. But just to sort of describe what came out of these was, first of all, the reliability was not bad. In other words, if you look at reliability, this is just neural data now. Sorry, this is a reliability plot. So what this is saying is that actually, basically, the stuff that's reliable responses is in auditory cortex, and outside of it, there's some reliability, but significantly less, okay? If you look at median predictivity as a function of model layer, you see peaking in this sort of slightly later regions of the model. But in particular, if you look at predictivity differences between high and low model layers, what you see is that like model predicts early layers are much better at predicting this sort of primary area. That's what's outlined in blue. Okay, that's using a different like a separate like primary area finding localizer. So that's where the lower areas are much better than the higher areas at predicting responses. But in these non-primary areas, later layers were significantly better. That's what the blue means. So this was interesting and encouraging because it suggested that we could figure out, sort of confirm and like deepen our understanding of where the like hierarchical structure in the auditory cortex was in humans, which was hard otherwise. So early layers are better explanation of primary cortex, where higher layers are better explanation of non-primary auditory cortex. There's a spectrotemporal filtering model that was around and sort of the best model for primary cortex. And so just comparing to that, in the high reliability areas, what we saw was about the same. This is a bad color plot, but in particular, what you're seeing is that this sort of like kind of dark yellow is where the deep net was about the same as the spectrotemporal model, and the yellow is where it was better, where the deep net was better. And what you see is sort of basically the case that primary auditory cortex was about as well predicted by earlier layers of this model as the spatiotemporal models that had been there before, although it's actually a bit better. So there's stuff going on in primary auditory cortex that's captured by early layers of the network that are not captured by the spatiotemporal model, okay? But there's significant improvements basically everywhere, but especially in these non-primary areas where it's really hard to do much with the spatiotemporal model. You can also look at a kind of region of interest basis. So in that topic area, what you see is variance is best explained in intermediate layers. And that's interesting actually because it's not the early layers that are best explaining primary auditory cortex. It's intermediate layers, suggesting that, and this is something that others have seen in some sort of anecdotal way, is that probably relative to visual cortex, early so-called primary auditory cortex is actually more stages in. There's more stuff going on in the subcortex and auditory system relative to the whole system than there is in the sort of same thing in vision. Okay, so Perhaps it would be the case that if we had good subcortical data, we'd see early layers mapping to, say, inferior colliculus or something like that. We don't have that data, so it's hard to say, but it's an interesting question. If you look in speech selective cortex, this is speech selective cortex generated a different way with, like outlined with an independent localizer. What you see is that performance, predictivity goes up through the layers. Maybe not totally surprisingly, since we optimized for a speech selection task. But if you look in a bunch of different ROIs, so tonotopic, but also pitch selective, music selective, speech selective, what you see is that you get significantly better predictions out of the task optimized CNN, but especially in sort of non-tonotopic, non-primary areas. So music selection, for instance, music selective area. And now we're really trying to bore into that to see if, if we have models that have multiple different selection criteria. So for example, not just word recognition, but something to do with music. It's a little hard to formalize that task in a good way, but we think we have an idea for how to do that. Then perhaps we can get finer structure in auditory cortex that would be otherwise hard to come up with. Have some hypotheses for figuring out where we think their structure are there. And we think we have been able to identify that there are maybe several streams, in particular within word recognition for finer structure. So just to compare this to the sort of previous vision work, what we see is if you look at word recognition performance on the task that I mentioned earlier, and auditory cortex predictivity on that 165 stimulus set, that there's actually quite a strong correlation here. Each dot here is a different model again. And I find it, I'm a little embarrassed about this plot because the number is very high, and but nonetheless, we reproduced this a couple of different ways. There's this quite strong correlation in this regime. And this is really just to say that although the structures are different, and the tasks are different, and the data is different, and if you take a vision model and you try to use it to explain auditory cortex data, it's significantly less good, then nonetheless there's this sort of principle that binds them together, that basically if you optimize for a task with a reasonable-ish structure, then you get a pretty good predictor of intermediate neural computations. So maybe it's a little grandiose to call this a principle, it's more of a heuristic, that if you're really bad, if you want to get a good model or a better model than you have now of some cortical area, and your current models are terrible at the tasks that you think that the area performs, make the models better at the tasks, right? And then perhaps if they're sort of somewhat neurally reasonable, then by combining those constraints, you get a better prediction in the sort of more intermediate, more detailed levels. And of course, this is not beautiful in the same way that like this was, right? It's like we don't get like a beautiful picture for what the receptive field structure is. Despite a lot of trying, there's not a lot of great results like visualizing what the filters are, right? We did a lot of that, and it wasn't that successful, and other people have done it and done it better than us. But again, I don't feel like it's that successful in the sense that although you can sometimes see what some filters are doing sometimes on some ways, it's very messy. It's like some units seem to be predictable, but most not. Some units seem to be understandable, but most not. So, I'm not saying that this type of understanding is impossible for higher visual areas. Maybe one day we will figure it out. But what I'm saying is kind of in the meantime, there is a sense in which there's something deeply principled going on here. Like basically, what are the knobs when you build a network, right? You have to formulate a model class. In this case, it's the CNN class. Oh, I should say in the picture, this visualization, there's sort of like each point in here is some model, and as you go out through, sort of go out of these outer radii, you get more and deeper networks, right? It's just a dumb way of visualizing architecture class space. But then within, the model class, only some submanifolds of models actually are able to perform any given ethologically valid task, right? Most models suck at any given task, and so a small subset is able to do each task. So sort of tasks pick out these bits of the space. And of course, to get there from an arbitrary initial starting point, you need to implement some kind of generic learning rule, okay? In this case, and sort of mostly going forward, we have gradient descent with hyperparameters on the metaparameter selection. And then once you've done that, you can map the brain data, right? You can say, like, look, to what extent is it the case that, like, you get a strong constraint by doing this process that allows you to say something about what the internal structure is. That's principled, even if it's not quite as sort of structurally elegant as being able to interpret the receptive fields. Of course, you can think of these three things in a sort of formal way, and we do this as like a way to figure out how to make models better. Architecture class task, which is sort of a loss function in a data set, and then our learning rule, which is a mixture of, as I say, hyperparameter optimization and gradient descent. Of course, it's really not a principle in the sense that, of course, if you push it too far, it doesn't work, right? If you push the performance on any given thing beyond human performance, you're probably not going to get better at predicting neurons. In fact, we see that ResNet isn't better at predicting neural responses than VGG, right? VGG is definitely better than what we had back in 2012, 2013, but it's not enormously better, somewhat better, and also it gets worse as you eventually start to push too far. So, you know, I'm not saying that there's this deep principle by which categorization optimization is the answer to the visual system. It's not. It's just one proxy task that gets you closer than, you know, otherwise you would have. But of course, you know, I'm really interested in things beyond this domain. So, you know, instead of CNNs, just looking at recurrent networks, instead of, you know, categorization, looking at task switching, ideally somebody would hand me a better, more biologically realistic learning rule than strict backpropagation. I'm going to leave that problem alone since it's hard. But then, you know, I'm really interested in mapping to other brain regions as well, you know, parietal cortex, frontal cortex. So, you know, just what's going on in the lab now. Well, we're just getting set up. But things that are of interest is we're really interested in looking at recurrent architecture for dynamic tasks. So, you know, instead of just a feed-forward structure, have local recurrences, have long-range recurrences, and have, you know, long-range skips and long-range, you know, feedbacks. And think about both like tasks like action recognition, which are inherently dynamic, as well as time discounting. So you've got to do it, but you've got to do it fast, accurately but fast, right? Or things like situations where there's heavy occlusion. But basically taking the same strategies, optimize for these tasks, and then check against both the static data, maybe we'll be better than 50%, and also dynamic data, looking at the neural response patterns themselves, you know, the dynamics over time. Can we predict non-trivial structures in the way that the neurons change, which they certainly do, right? Like I talked about the situation where you know, we were binning from 70 to 170 milliseconds, but there's reliable dynamics at the 10 or 20 millisecond range. And what are those patterns doing? And the issue came up earlier about the animals doing a task. That's a place where we think that it's clear that there are some differences. That is to say, the dynamics are different when the animals are doing a task. And probably it cashes out in some fraction of the images that are harder being doable for those animals, but a small fraction. So, you know, maybe the absolute performance numbers aren't that different, but the subset that is different is really interesting and tells you something about how recurrent dynamics is doing processing. Okay, so this is one direction I think is really interesting. I'm also interested in sort of pushing into other cortical areas. I showed you two, like vision and audition, you know, visual cortex and auditory cortex. But I really wanted to go into a non-human animal or non-primate because all sorts of interesting like neuroscience techniques can be done in these other systems. And so one of the most interesting cortical areas to me is rodent somatosensory cortex, in particular whisker trigeminal system, because it's very advanced. The animal is doing something very interesting with its whiskers. And so, you know, not only is it like it's sort of probably better using its whiskers than it is seeing. And so we came up with the idea this is work with Mitra Hartman at Northwestern, who's a whisker expert, on building neural networks that basically we built a sensor model, 3D sensor model, and then look at trying to solve sort of reasonably, somewhat ecologically relevant shape detection tasks with that type of input, okay? And those are all end up having to be recurrent models because it's a very temporal signal, okay? And that's work that's underway. We have some pretty good models there, and so now we're in the process of comparing to you know, cortical data from that system. Of course, the biggest hole probably in the thing that I've said so far is that although maybe it's the case that the adult state is reasonably predictive by the models, by, you know, optimizing for categorization, the learning rules, the learning task is terribly abiological, right? In the sense that no human presumably, but certainly no macaque has access to thousands of labels in each of thousands of categories. That's just crazy, right? So, but nonetheless, the system does a good job, right? So really, we need to, if you go back to the picture I made a couple slides ago of these three things, you even if we know what our architecture class is okay in the visual system, and even if we are going to assume, okay, that we are, even if we assume that we're going to be using sort of gradient descent-based methods, that, obviously there's something wrong with our task, with our loss function and our data set. Okay, so a big region of interest in the lab is trying to figure out better tasks for self-supervised learning, right? And trying to be as creative as possible here, because we're feeling like there's been a lot of negative results coming out of autoencoders and similar things. So one of these things that's most interesting to us is future prediction under agent-controlled action, so interactive data set construction. But this is a hard task, and I don't have a lot to report on that yet, although it's a really interesting direction. And finally, although it's the case that you might have a system that has like a really great representation that can do all these different tasks, like I showed you earlier, like categorization, localization, size, pose, blah, 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 right? On any given task in the world, you're actually only ever doing one of them, right? And you have to figure out which one it is and learn them fast. You have to choose them, and you have to learn how to switch between them, right? So we're looking to try to understand what the kind of meta controller architecture is here that allows us an agent like this is sort of embodied in a world to do continual learning in a reasonable way. Okay, that is to say, figure out what tasks are happening now, learn readouts that are good for them, learn how to build readouts in a way that use the information that you already have efficiently, and then switch flexibly between them. So those are some ongoing projects in the group that kind of build out from deep, rich sensory models, but go to try to deepen our understanding, but also like use them to understand other cognitive domains as well. But anyway, I should just leave you by saying, look, that there's these kind of task-driven modeling can make, significantly improve quantitative models of high and intermediate level cortical areas. There can be qualitative insight if you, if you work at it. And also, the concepts are useful across multiple sensory modalities. So that's what I have to say. And please, let's ask, some more questions would be great. So. Sure.
I have a question that might be a little bit more specific to the earlier part on cognition, specifically how you get to object recognition across all that variation. Like, at the end of the day, what is the representation that, what do you think representation is that ultimately gets stored in memory? What is the model pulling out that, is stable across all these variations?
Yeah, you want understanding like this, roughly, right? Like, what did I say? This thing, you want kind of like understanding like this.
Yeah.
What are the features doing?
Almost a qualitative one, but
Yeah.
I think there's a quantitative, there could be a quantitative
There could be.
answer.
Well, if you know how to do it, let me know. I've been very unsatisfied by our own and other people's efforts to make a kind of word-level story of what the features are computing. I mean, I can tell you at some level, they're computing what they need to compute, so the next level can compute what it needs to compute, so the next level can compute what it needs to compute, so at the end you solve the task, right? And that's a story, right? It's like saying, look, you've got this big nonlinear system. It was optimized by evolution and development to solve this big nonlinear task. There you are, right? That's an explanation of some kind. But I think you want us to sort of basically, okay, let me put it this way. I have a high criteria for what it would have to be to have a visualization or an explanation of the units be useful. Specifically, you'd have to be able to reduce the training time by virtue of whatever insight you have. So if you could tell me, look, I mean, knowing this thing reduces the training time a lot. You can just stick it in, right, if you have an intuition for it, if you have your Gabor formulas. Or, certainly, like unsupervised data, the sparse autoencoding approach, right, is much cheaper than what we have to do. The labels are cheap comparatively, right, so it's great, right? If there were some insight that allowed you to get out of having that bad supervision task as driving it, then that would be a way of reducing the training data in some sense. And I think that would be really great.
What have you tested the models against? Some of the vision models that are out there, so like O's GIST model, like a view-dependent model.
Yeah, you remember those gray bars that were sucked? Those sucked even harder at the high variation, yeah.
So this choice of your basis set is, the difficulty in trying to see so at the outset and going to training as a way of resolving that.
You're asking some interesting, right? So there's a number of different questions embedded in there which are interesting. I think there's one question which is sort of the easy version, so I'll answer that one first, which is like, how much did neuroscience help? Okay, how much does neuroanatomy tell you? And I think it's a very long road in the sense that, like, you know, I was talking to somebody about this earlier today, that the first convnets were developed by a Japanese guy, Fukushima, back in the late 70s. And he told me at lunch one day that the reason he knew to use convnet structure was because his neighbor down the hall at NHK Labs was Tanaka, Keiji Tanaka, who was a neuroscientist, who told him, look, the Vigilant system solves this with hierarchical retinotopic structure. And you know, Fukushima was like a mathematician, so he was like, oh, a hierarchical retinotopical structure, that's like repeated convolutions, right? So I don't know how true the story is, but that's what he said. And like, that's sort of the kind of thing that happens once in a lifetime slowly in this kind of unpredictable way where, you know, like some insight from, qualitative insight from neuroscience may help you make a better model. And it took a long time for the models to be actually engineered to the point where they were better. And the same thing could be said for a bunch of those. Remember I showed you those sort of intermediate steps like filtering, and that's the convolution part, but also like the different nonlinearities that were in there. Like neuroscientists figured out stuff about divisive normalization and other types of normalization steps before they were useful from a convnet operation point of view. But it was very uncertain, and there was lots of things that could go wrong in implementing them. And so it was really not a direct translation. So, you know, I don't, in my own work, I certainly am not counting on neuroscience insight to tell me what to do next in a detailed way, right? I mean, I would say half of my group does AI, does machine learning AI, on the hope that by solving more interesting tasks, we'll have some stuff that will be models for neural processes that we currently can't even begin to approach. Then there was another version of the question, which is harder, and I'll rephrase it and then punt on it, which is basically, is it the case that there are other model classes that are not convolution in some sense, whatever you mean by not convolutional, that predict the neural data as well and solve the task as well? And the current answer to that is, well, there's one problem in there, which is, what do you even mean by not convolutional, right? Like, of course, it's the case that something might not formally look convolutional, but actually compute the same functions intermediately. So, so modulo that definitional issue, okay, the answer is at this point, no, there are no other classes, not even that solve the task that well. So that we know, well, okay, so exactly, we don't have a positive control there, right? And so I wish we did, and it would be a great question to answer in that case. And so I have to punt on it basically because I don't know, we don't have it. I don't know, maybe we'll never have it, or like maybe there's a universality, maybe basically the only types of networks that solve it are of that form. Maybe there's something else that's, quote, really different in some way, but somehow you could solve the categorization task well, but then doesn't look like neural data. And that would be a great positive control. Okay, let me put it this way. You can do the following thing, which is you can take a shallow neural network, okay, and you can approximate the deep neural networks to some extent with the shallow neural networks. And they, to some extent, explain the neural data, explain the responses, solve the task. But they're terrible at explaining neural response patterns in like V4 or something. So in a way, maybe that's like something like, it's kind of a jury-rigged positive control. That's basically the universal approximation theorem failing. I mean, the universal approximation theorem is true, but it applies in funny ways. And so like a shallow neural network that can approximate the deep neural network I/O isn't necessarily going to have intermediate steps that look like, you know, or going to have neurons that look like the intermediate steps. And so in a way, that's a bit of a positive control, but I think you'd want something better than that. But I don't know how to give it to you at this point. Yeah.
Like, maybe why don't I suggest, since it is getting on to be 10 to 5, maybe we could continue this discussion at the reception outside. Would that be all right?
Okay.
All right, well,
All right.
let's thank Dan.
Thanks for having me.